Under the golden lights of the grand hall, the seats were filled with rich families, respected teachers, and proud parents who had come to see their talented children perform. Everyone wore fine clothes, polished shoes, and sparkling jewelry. The air smelled of perfume, and the sound of quiet chatter filled the space. All eyes turned toward the stage as the next performer was called. But when the young girl stepped out, the mood changed instantly. She was small, thin, and dressed in clothes that did not belong to such an event. Her dress was faded with tiny tears at the edges, and her shoes were so worn out they looked like they could fall apart at any step. Her hair was tied in a messy way, not like the neat braids of the other children. The crowd froze for a moment, then the whispers started. Some people laughed quietly, covering their mouths. Others did not bother to hide their cruel smiles. "Look at her," someone said softly. "She looks like she belongs on the street." "Not on a stage," another man chuckled. "Maybe she is lost." "This is not a place for beggars." Even some children pointed at her and laughed. The girl could hear every word. But she kept walking forward, her hands were shaking, and her heart beat like a drum in her chest. Still, her eyes were steady. She knew why she was there. She had a chance, maybe her only chance, and she could not let it slip away. The stage looked huge compared to her small figure. The piano sat in the center, shiny and black. Its keys gleamed under the lights. Waiting for her touch, she walked slowly, each step echoing louder than it should. Every pair of eyes in the hall followed her. Some were filled with doubt, others with mockery. A few, very few, looked curious, wondering if she had something to prove. As she reached the piano, she paused for a moment. She placed her hand on the bench, then looked at the crowd. Their faces blurred before her like waves in the ocean. She remembered all the days she practiced on an old broken piano. The keys chipped, the sound cracked. She remembered playing while her stomach growled from hunger. She remembered closing her eyes and imagining a crowd listening to her music. Not to her clothes or her face, but to her heart. That memory gave her strength. The hall was restless. People whispered louder now. "This is going to be painful to watch," a woman muttered. A boy snickered. "She probably doesn't even know how to sit at the piano." A few clapped their hands in a mocking way. Claps that were not of encouragement but of insult. The judges raised their eyebrows. One of them leaned back in his chair, already ready to mark her down. The girl finally sat on the bench, her legs barely touched the ground. She placed her hands in her lap for a moment. Her breath shook, she lowered her head and closed her eyes. For a few seconds she did not hear the crowd. She only heard the sound of her heartbeat. And in her mind she whispered to herself, "You are not here for them, you are here for the music." The hall grew a little quieter as the audience waited. Some leaned forward, expecting to laugh again when she failed. Others crossed their arms, annoyed that time was being wasted. But the girl did not rush. She lifted her hands slowly, her fingers hovering just above the keys, the lights reflected in her eyes, which no longer showed fear but determination. For that single moment, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. The piano was silent, the crowd restless, and the young girl, mocked and doubted, was about to decide her own fate. She pressed her first key and everything changed. The moment the girl sat on the bench, the hall filled with uneasy laughter. The sound was sharp, like knives cutting into her already trembling heart. A group of teenagers in the back clapped loudly, but not in support. They clapped to mock her. "Go on then," one of them whispered loudly. "Show us how a street rat plays music." A woman in a glittering gown leaned to her husband and said, "This will be embarrassing. I can't believe they allowed her in here." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "This is no place for children like her. This stage is meant for talent, not charity." The girl heard them all. Every cruel word seemed to echo in her mind. But she sat quietly. Her small hands rested on her lap, and she tried not to look at the faces staring at her. She could feel their eyes like fire. Burning into her skin, her body wanted to run, but her heart whispered for her to stay. She had not come this far to run away. The judges also seemed unimpressed, one of them. An old man with gray hair and a strict face leaned back in his chair. His pen tapped against the table slowly, as if he already knew what score he would write. Another judge shook her head slightly, whispering to the one beside her, "This child is out of place. This performance will not last long." They were waiting for her to fail, waiting for the mistake they could laugh at later. The girl took a deep breath, but it came out shaky. She placed her hand on the edge of the piano. Trying to steady herself, the piano was smooth and cold. so different from the old broken one she practiced on at home. The crowd was growing restless. Some coughed loudly, others shifted in their seats. A man even shouted from the side, "Play something if you can. Don't waste our time." More laughter followed his voice. Her face flushed red, her throat tight. She wanted to disappear. She wanted to vanish into thin air and escape the cruel eyes watching her. But then she remembered her small room back home. She remembered the cracked walls, the smell of dust, and the single broken piano she had learned on. She remembered the nights she played while her mother sat beside her, whispering, "Don't listen to them, listen to yourself." That memory gave her a spark of courage. She finally pulled out the bench and sat properly. Her feet barely touched the ground, and the piano keys seemed bigger than her hands. Some people giggled again. "She looks like a doll sitting there," a young boy whispered. His father laughed. "Yes, but a doll with no skill." The girl closed her eyes for a moment. She could not erase their voices, but she could block them, she told herself. "If I play from my heart, they will hear me, not their own laughter." She opened her eyes slowly, her gaze fixed on the white and black keys in front of her. The world outside blurred, and all she saw was the instrument she had dreamed of touching her entire life. The same people who laughed at her would soon know who she really was. Her hands lifted, trembling like leaves in the wind. The lights above reflected in her dark eyes, and her lips pressed together with quiet strength. The hall quieted slightly, but not out of respect. They were waiting for her to embarrass herself. They were waiting for her to strike the wrong key, to stumble, to freeze. Some even leaned forward in excitement, ready to laugh at the moment she failed. It was not a silence of faith, but of cruel anticipation. The girl could feel it, but she did not let go. She let the silence wrap around her like a shield. For a few seconds, everything felt still. Her heart was pounding so loud, she thought the people in the front row could hear it. Her hands hovered above the piano. She thought of all the hours she had practiced alone, all the tears she had shed when her fingers hurt, but she refused to stop. She thought of the hunger, the cold, and the loneliness that had built the music in her soul. This was not just a performance, it was her life speaking through her fingers. The laughter behind her faded into whispers. The smirks on the judges' faces stayed, but their eyes were fixed on her. She knew she had one chance, one moment to prove them all wrong. Her shoulders straightened, her breath slowed. Her body stopped trembling, and then, with a courage she did not know she had, she lowered her fingers to the keys. The first note was about to break the cruel silence of the hall. The same silence that had been filled with insults and doubt. In that breathless moment, the little girl, mocked and insulted, was ready to begin a performance that would make the world forget her torn clothes and see only her heart. The first note rose into the hall like a whisper, soft and fragile. It was not what the audience expected. They had thought the girl would hit the wrong key or play something childish and broken. But instead, the piano spoke with a voice so gentle that even the cruelest whisper fell silent. The sound carried across the room like the beginning of a story, and for the first time since she had walked onto the stage, the laughter stopped. Her fingers moved slowly at first, careful and tender, as though she was afraid the sound would slip away if she pressed too hard. Every key she touched gave birth to something pure, like drops of water falling into a still pond. The audience leaned closer, confused by what they were hearing. This was not the clumsy sound of an untrained child. This was music, real music, born from somewhere deep inside her heart. A man who had laughed earlier tilted his head. His smile faded as he listened. A woman who had been whispering cruel things now sat quietly, her lips pressed together. The judges, who had been ready to write down low scores, paused and looked up. The old man with the gray hair stopped tapping his pen. His sharp eyes softened, just slightly. The girl continued, her hands moving with more confidence now. Each note seemed to blend into the next, weaving a thread of sound that wrapped itself around the people in the hall. She was no longer the poor child in faded clothes. She was a storyteller, and the piano was her voice. Her music carried memories, emotions, and dreams, and the audience could feel it, even if they did not understand why. With every passing moment, her music grew stronger. It rose like a wave, slow but powerful. Some people in the back who had been whispering leaned forward, trying to catch every sound. A young boy in the front, who had been ready to laugh, stared with wide eyes. His mother, who had insulted the girl's appearance, now placed a hand over her heart without realizing it. The notes floated like colors in the air, painting pictures in the minds of everyone listening. Some felt as if they were standing in a quiet forest with leaves falling gently around them. Others felt as though they were watching a lonely child walk under the stars, searching for hope. Her music was more than sound, it was feeling, and it filled the hall in a way words never could. The girl closed her eyes as she played. She no longer saw the faces before her, no longer heard their laughter. She was lost in the world she created. The piano keys became her friends, her companions who had always been there waiting for her touch. The music flowed out of her like water bursting from a spring, and once it began, nothing could stop it. The audience, who had expected failure, sat trapped in a strange silence. It was not the silence of boredom, but of awe. They did not dare speak for fear of breaking the magic. The very people who mocked her felt something stir inside them, a small pain in their chest, a reminder of things they had forgotten. Loneliness, hope, dreams, loss, all of it came alive in the sound of her piano. The judges leaned closer now. One of them, a woman known for her coldness, felt her throat tighten. She did not want to admit it, but her eyes were growing wet. She whispered to herself, This is not just a performance." The old man with the pen nodded slowly, his hand frozen above his paper. He realized he was not just listening. He was being carried into a story minute by minute. The hall transformed. The walls that had echoed with cruel laughter now carried music that made people's hearts tremble. A boy in the back lowered his head, ashamed of the jokes he had made. A proud man who had laughed at her clothes found himself gripping his chair tightly, trying to understand why his chest felt heavy. The girl's small body swayed with the rhythm. Her hair fell across her face, her hands moved faster, flowing like wind across water. She poured every memory of her struggle into the keys, the nights of hunger, the loneliness of being laughed at, the dream of one day being seen for who she really was. All of it lived in her music. The audience could feel it. They could feel the pain, but they could also feel the strength. The music did not beg for pity. It demanded to be heard. It was not the sound of weakness, but of courage, and the people, once so ready to mock, now listened as though they were under a spell. The first note had been a whisper, but now the hall was full of her voice. A voice no one expected. Her music had reached them, even those who wished not to be touched by it. And though they did not yet realize it, the girl had already begun to change the hearts of everyone in the room. She pressed another chord, and the sound rose high into the ceiling, filling every corner of the grand hall. The same piano they thought would betray her had become her ally, carrying her truth where words had failed. And with each passing second, it became clear to all this was no ordinary child. This was someone who could turn mockery into silence, and silence into tears. The girl, once seen as a joke, was becoming something else entirely. And the crowd, trapped in her song, had no choice but to listen. Her fingers moved across the piano as if they were alive on their own. Each note carried more than just sound, it carried her life. The audience began to feel that she was not simply playing music. She was telling a story without words, a story that belonged to her but now belonged to them too. The melody softened, almost like a whisper. And in that soft sound, people could feel the loneliness of a little girl walking through cold streets. They could imagine her shivering in the night, her stomach empty, her eyes searching for hope. The sound was fragile, but it touched something deep inside every heart. Some in the crowd lowered their eyes, ashamed because they had laughed at her only moments before. Then with a sudden rise, her hand struck the keys with strength. The music no longer whispered, it shouted. It spoke of hunger that refused to break her, of nights she cried but still kept going. The audience felt the struggle, the fight, the weight of sadness and courage blending into one. Mothers in the hall thought of their children. Fathers thought of the times they had failed to protect their families, and old men thought of the dreams they had lost. The music connected them all. Every key was alive with emotion, and it felt as if the piano was not just an instrument, but a window into her soul. The hall that had once been full of laughter and insult was now wrapped in silence. No one dared to move. Some people held their breath without even realizing it, afraid that the smallest sound would disturb the fragile magic around them. She leaned forward as she played, her small body swaying with the rhythm. Her eyes were closed, but her face showed everything: pain, hope, longing, and strength. It was not the face of a child trying to impress. It was the face of someone who had lived through storms and refused to be broken. The crowd began to see not her torn dress or messy hair, but the fire inside her, The music transformed her, making her bigger than the stage, bigger than their laughter. The melody shifted again, soft and sweet now. It sounded like the gentle voice of a mother soothing her child. Like a candle glowing in the dark, people in the audience wiped their eyes. Some cried quietly, not even knowing why. It was because her story had reached them. It was because her heart had become their heart, and they could no longer keep the tears inside. Even the judges, who had been waiting for her to fail, were moved. The strict old man who had looked at her with cold eyes now leaned forward. His hand no longer tapped the pen. Instead, he gripped it tightly as if the music was holding him still. The woman beside him sniffed quietly, trying to hide the tears that were welling in her eyes. They had seen many performances in their lives, but this one was different. It was not skill alone, it was truth. Her fingers danced faster now, the music climbing higher and higher. It was like watching someone run through rain, falling but rising again. The sound was both desperate and strong. It carried the pain of being mocked, the weight of being poor, but also the courage of standing up anyway. It was a story of defeat and victory playing out right before them. The people forgot they were in a hall. They forgot the golden lights and fine clothes. They forgot their cruel words. They were simply lost in her story. The girl was no longer afraid. Her body no longer shook. Her hands were steady and sure. She had left behind the world that laughed at her. She was inside her own world now, a world she had built note by note, a world where no one could hurt her because she was stronger than all their laughter. And the people could feel that strength wrapping around them like a tide. Tears shone in the eyes of strangers who had never cared for her. A man who had mocked her at the start wiped his face quickly. Trying to hide his shame, a young girl in the front row clutched her mother's hand, whispering, "She's amazing," and the mother nodded, unable to speak through her tears. The crowd that had once been united in cruelty was now united in awe. The story in her music was not just hers anymore. It was theirs too. Every person in the hall could feel their own struggles inside her melody. They remembered their own hunger, their own loneliness, their own secret dreams. Her music was not begging for pity. It was reminding them of their humanity. It was showing them the beauty hidden in pain, the courage found in weakness, the light inside the dark. Her fingers slowed again. The melody soft as the end of a prayer. The sound floated gently like falling snow, touching every heart one last time before fading. The audience sat frozen, their eyes wet, their hearts trembling. The same people who had mocked her were now her witnesses. Witnesses to a story they would never forget. The girl lifted her hands from the keys and let the last note fade into the air. She opened her eyes slowly, breathing hard. She saw the faces before her, no longer twisted with laughter but softened by tears. For the first time that night, she allowed herself a small smile. She had given them everything she had, and they had finally heard her. The music poured out of her like light from a broken window, and the grand hall that once rang with laughter was now filled with silence so deep it could almost be touched. The audience, who had mocked her the moment she walked in, could not look away. They sat frozen in their seats, their eyes wide, their chests heavy. They had expected to see a mistake, a failure, a reason to laugh. Instead, they were watching something pure, something greater than themselves. A woman in the front row pressed a hand to her chest, her expensive necklace shining under the golden lights. Tears slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. She had not cried in years, yet this little girl's piano had broken through her walls. Beside her, her husband shifted uncomfortably, wiping at his eyes as though something had entered them. But he knew it was not dust, it was shame. He remembered how he had laughed when the girl entered, how he had whispered cruel words. Now those same words echoed in his head like poison. Children who had pointed fingers at the girl now sat with their mouths open. Some leaned forward, their eyes shining. Their laughter had died long ago, and in its place was wonder. They were too young to understand everything, but they felt the truth in her music. It was like a story told in a language older than words, and it spoke directly to their small hearts. The judges, who had been ready to dismiss her, now leaned closer. Their papers were forgotten, their pens still. One judge's eyes glistened as she whispered to herself, "This is not a performance, this is a confession." Another judge, the strict old man, sat as still as stone, but inside, his heart was trembling. He had heard countless students play with skill, but never had he felt such raw honesty in music. It was as if this child had reached into the core of life itself and placed it on the keys. The girl kept playing, her small hands moving with grace and fire. She did not see the tears in the audience. She did not notice the silence. She was far away inside her own world, pouring out years of pain, hunger, and hope. She played for her mother who had always believed in her, for the broken piano she had practiced on, for the nights she had cried alone but kept going. Every note was a piece of her soul, and she gave it all without holding back. By now, many in the audience were crying. Men who had never shown weakness wiped their faces quickly, pretending no one saw. Women who had once sneered at her clothes now clutched tissues in their hands. Ashamed of the things they had said, even the children grew quiet, sensing the weight of what they were witnessing. It was not just music, it was a storm, a prayer, and a dream all at once. The hall itself seemed transformed. The chandeliers still shone, the velvet seats still gleamed, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. The air was heavy with emotion. People breathed slower, afraid of disturbing the fragile magic around them. The grand piano no longer looked like just an instrument. It was alive, breathing through the girl's touch. Her music rose higher, louder, filling every corner of the room. It was not noise, it was power. The sound carried a message no one could ignore, that even the smallest, poorest, most broken soul could hold greatness inside. The audience could feel the truth pressing on them, bending their pride, breaking their arrogance. They had laughed at her, but now their laughter was gone, replaced by tears they could not stop. The girl's body swayed as she played. Her hair fell loose, her fingers moved faster. Her whole being was one with the piano, and the audience sat powerless, chained to every note. Some whispered prayers. Some clutched the hands of loved ones. Others simply let their tears fall without shame. In the middle of the hall, a proud man who had earlier joked, "This will be painful to watch," now hid his face in his hands. His shoulders shook as quiet sobs escaped. He could not bear to look at the girl because he knew he had judged her wrongly. A young boy whispered to his mother, "Why did they laugh at her?" And the mother had no answer because the truth cut too deep. Minute by minute, the silence grew heavier. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of reverence. It was the kind of silence that falls in a church, in a place where hearts are open and raw. Her piano had become a sermon, and the people were her unwilling congregation. They had come to watch entertainment, but instead, they were facing their own hearts. The judges exchanged glances, unable to hide their emotions anymore. The woman judge dabbed her eyes, whispering, "She is not just playing. She is living through those keys." The old man nodded, though he said nothing. He could not. His throat was too tight and his pride too shaken. The girl reached the softer part of her melody, a gentle stream of sound that felt like forgiveness. The notes floated like feathers, tender and light. It was as though she was forgiving them, forgiving the laughter, forgiving the cruel whispers. That softness was worse than punishment because it broke them even more. It reminded them that she was stronger than their hate. By the time she neared the end of her piece, the hall was soaked in tears. No one dared to clap, yet no one dared to speak. The music was still alive, and they wanted to stay inside it for as long as they could. The same crowd that had once mocked her had been silenced, humbled, and changed by the song of a little girl they thought was nothing. And as the last trembling notes began to fade, the people realized they were not just hearing music. They were hearing her life, her pain, her courage, and her victory. The hall was quiet, but in every chest a storm of emotions raged. The silence was no longer cruel. It was sacred. The girl, who had entered in rags, had made them cry with nothing but her heart and her piano. And the night, once filled with laughter, now belonged to her. Her hands trembled only for a second. Then they pressed the last keys. The music swelled higher and higher, as if her soul was climbing to the top of a mountain. The audience sat breathless, their eyes locked on her small figure. Each note carried fire and tears, and when the final sound rang out, it was like a bell echoing across the night sky. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The last note hung in the air, fragile and pure. The girl's fingers froze above the keys, her body still. She did not dare move, afraid that even the smallest shift would break the magic. The piano was silent now, but the silence was louder than thunder. The audience sat in stunned quiet, the sound of their own breathing the only thing they could hear. Some held their hands to their mouths. Others gripped the sides of their seats, no one able to look away. Then something unexpected happened. Tears rolled down the cheeks of men who had laughed earlier. Women who had whispered cruel words were now wiping their faces with trembling hands. The silence was not emptiness, it was full of shame, full of wonder, full of something they could not explain. It was as if her music had stolen the ground from beneath them, and they did not know how to stand anymore. The girl lowered her hands to her lap slowly. Her chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. She looked down at the keys, not daring to meet their eyes yet. She was still that poor child in faded clothes, but in that moment she felt like something else, something greater. She had given them everything inside her, and she was not sure if they had heard it. For a long moment the hall remained frozen. The judges sat still, their pens useless in their hands. The old man stared at her with wet eyes, his lips pressed tightly as if holding back words he could not yet speak. The woman judge, who had scoffed at her earlier, now wiped her cheeks. She wanted to say something, but her throat closed, and she could only bow her head, and then, like a spark that bursts into fire, it began. A single pair of hands clapped softly, hesitant at first, then another joined, louder, until the hall erupted with thunderous applause. The sound filled the room. Bouncing off the golden walls and high ceiling, people rose from their seats. Unable to stay sitting, they shouted, "Bravo! Bravo!" And their clapping became wild, desperate, like they were trying to apologize through their hands. The girl finally lifted her head. Her eyes widened in shock as she saw the same people who had laughed now standing. Some clapped until their hands turned red. Others shouted her name, even though they had only just learned it. The faces that had mocked her now glowed with awe and respect. The air shook with the sound of their cheers. The girl stood slowly and bowed her head. Her small body looked fragile against the storm of applause, but she carried herself with grace. She did not smile widely. She only let a small, shy curve touch her lips. It was not pride, it was relief. Relief that they had finally heard her. Not her clothes, not her appearance, but her music. People in the crowd shouted for more. Some waved their hands in the air, begging her to play again, but she only shook her head gently. She had already given them everything, and there was nothing left to give. The applause grew louder, echoing through the hall like rolling waves. Reporters who had sat in the back rushed forward, scribbling notes, their cameras flashing. They wanted to capture the girl who had turned an entire hall of cruelty into tears. The story was too powerful to ignore. She was no longer a poor child in torn clothes. She was the musician who had silenced them all. The judges rose to their feet, clapping with the rest of the audience. The strict old man, who rarely showed emotion, wiped his glasses slowly, his hands trembling. He leaned toward the microphone but stopped. Unable to speak, the words caught in his throat. Instead, he bowed his head toward her, a gesture of respect that stunned everyone. The other judges followed, their eyes wet, their applause steady and strong. The girl's heart raced as she looked out at them. This was not the world she had imagined when she walked onto the stage. She had expected laughter, insults, and shame. She had been ready for failure, yet here she was, standing in front of people who now cheered her name. The applause wrapped around her like a warm blanket, protecting her from the cold she had known all her life. In the back of the hall, a man who had laughed the loudest earlier now shouted, "Forgive us!" His voice broke as tears streamed down his face. Others around him nodded, their eyes full of regret. They wanted to make it right, but they knew they never could. The only thing they could do was clap harder, shout louder, and hope she could hear the truth in their hearts. The girl bowed again, deeper this time. She did not need their forgiveness. She had already proven herself. The music had spoken for her, and it had spoken louder than their cruelty. She had shown them that greatness did not come from fine clothes or fancy names. It came from the fire inside a heart. And her heart had burned brighter than anything in that hall. As the applause thundered on, she stepped back from the piano, her head lowered, her small figure glowing under the stage lights. She walked slowly toward the edge of the stage, every step echoing in the silence between claps, and when she reached the curtain, she turned once more, her eyes shining not with pride, but with quiet strength. The hall shook with cheers. But inside her there was peace. She had come to prove herself, and she had. The crowd that mocked her had risen to their feet, their tears proof of her victory. And though she left the stage in torn clothes, she carried with her something priceless: dignity, respect, and the memory of a night when her music made the whole world cry. The thunder of applause still filled the hall when the girl stepped back from the piano. Her heart beat fast. Her hands were still shaking from the storm she had just released. She had never played on such a grand stage before, never in front of so many eyes. And now those same eyes were shining with tears. The crowd that had mocked her now stood for her, clapping, crying, and shouting her name. But beyond the noise, the moment everyone waited for had arrived. The judges had to speak. The strict old man who had sat with cold eyes at the beginning finally rose from his seat. His chair scraped against the floor, and the sound cut through the applause like a bell. Slowly the clapping softened. The cheers fell quiet, all eyes turned toward him. He was known for being harsh, for breaking dreams with a single word, and now everyone wondered what he would say to the little girl in the torn dress. He cleared his throat, his voice low and rough. For a moment he could not speak. His hand gripped the table as though the weight of the moment pressed on his chest. Then he said, "I have judged many performances in my life." His voice echoed in the hall, steady but heavy. "I have seen skill, I have seen talent, but tonight, I saw something greater." His words trembled slightly. His eyes locked on the girl. "You did not just play the piano. Child, you made it speak, you made it live." The audience gasped softly. Many could not believe what they were hearing. This man, who had crushed so many young performers with sharp words, was now trembling in front of a poor girl. The girl stood frozen, her small hands clutching the edge of her dress. She had never expected kindness from him, never expected tears in his eyes. But they were there, shining. The woman judge rose next. She was younger, her face usually cold. She had laughed under her breath when the girl had first walked on stage. But now her eyes were red. Her voice cracked as she spoke. "When you entered this hall, many of us judged you." She looked down, ashamed, then back at the girl. "We looked at your clothes, your shoes, and we thought you did not belong here. We were wrong." She placed a hand on her chest. "Tonight you reminded us what music truly is. It is not about appearance, it is about the soul and your soul. It touched us all." Her words sent murmurs through the hall. People nodded, tears fell again, and the girl lowered her eyes, her lips trembling as she tried to understand what was happening. The same people who had laughed were now standing with respect. The same judges who had doubted her were now praising her. The third judge, a middle-aged man with soft eyes, stood slowly. He smiled gently, his voice kind. "Do you see them, child?" he asked, gesturing to the crowd. "Do you see what you have done? You came here with nothing but your heart, and you gave it to us, and now every person in this hall will leave changed. That is a gift no one can ever take from you." He paused, his voice heavy with emotion. "You are not just a musician, you are an artist, a storyteller, and tonight, you made history." The crowd erupted again, applause rising like thunder. People shouted her name, some even whistled, and others raised their hands in the air. The girl bowed her head low, tears filling her eyes at last. She had held them back while she played, but now she could not. Her shoulders shook as quiet sobs escaped her, not of pain, but of relief. The old man judge raised a hand to quiet the crowd again. "Remember this," he said firmly. "Do not judge a soul by their clothes. Do not measure worth by wealth tonight." A little girl in torn shoes reminded us all of what we had forgotten. That greatness can come from anywhere. That beauty can live even in the poorest of places. We must never forget this lesson. His voice thundered, and the hall shook with applause once more. People shouted, "Bravo! Bravo!" Some even knelt in respect. Mothers held their children close, whispering, "Remember her, remember this night." Reporters scribbled furiously, their cameras flashing. They knew the world would want to hear this story, the story of a poor girl who made an entire hall cry. The girl finally lifted her face, her cheeks wet with tears. She looked at the judges, at the crowd, and then back at the piano. Her lips formed a small, shaky smile. She had dreamed of this moment, dreamed of being heard, and now it was real. Not because of money or clothes, but because of the truth inside her. She stepped forward, her small hands clutching the microphone. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but the hall was so quiet that every person heard her. "Thank you," she said simply. Her words carried more weight than the longest speech, because they came from a heart that had given everything. The applause rose again, filling the hall like a storm. The girl bowed deeply, her body small but her spirit larger than the room. She had faced their cruelty and turned it into tears. She had walked in mocked, and now she stood victorious, surrounded by respect she had earned with nothing but her soul. And as the judges looked at her, they knew they had witnessed something they would never forget. A night when music was not just played but lived. A night when a poor girl's piano made the whole world cry. The applause did not stop. It rolled through the grand hall like thunder. Wave after wave, the girl stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her head lowered. She felt the warmth of the lights on her face, but what burned brighter was the sound of hundreds of people clapping for her, cheering for her, crying because of her. She had walked in as a stranger, mocked for her torn clothes, and now she was standing as the heart of the night. Reporters rushed forward, their cameras flashing like stars. They shouted questions, their voices overlapping. "Who are you? Where did you learn to play? What is your name?" The girl stepped back, nervous. She was not used to so much attention. Her eyes darted around the hall, searching for an escape. But then she saw something that calmed her, the piano. It sat silently now, black and shining under the lights. Her friend, her voice, the only thing that had never betrayed her. She smiled faintly, whispering in her heart, "We did it." The audience could not stop themselves. Some people climbed onto their seats to clap louder. Others shouted apologies between cheers. "Forgive us," one man cried, his voice broken. He had been one of the first to laugh when she entered. But now tears streamed down his face. "You are greater than us all," he shouted, and the crowd around him nodded. The same mouths that had mocked her now praised her. The same eyes that had looked down on her now looked up with respect. In the front row, a mother leaned down to her daughter, whispering softly, "Do you see her? Remember her, child. This is what strength looks like. This is what beauty means." The daughter nodded, her small hands clapping hard, her eyes fixed on the girl like she was watching a hero. The judges rose from their seats once more, leading the applause themselves. They did not try to hide their emotions. The old man wiped his glasses again and whispered to the girl, even though the microphone was off, "You have changed us." The woman judge pressed a hand to her heart, bowing her head to her. It was more than victory, it was respect, and everyone in the hall could feel it. The girl finally took a step back from the piano. Her legs felt heavy, her chest still tight with emotion. She had given everything she had, and now she wanted nothing more than to leave quietly. But the crowd would not let her go unseen. They shouted louder, clapped harder. Some even stomped their feet. The wooden floor shook beneath her. It was not anger, it was love. A love she had never known before. Slowly, she walked to the edge of the stage. The heavy curtain waited behind her. But she turned back once more. She looked at the audience. Their faces blurred through her tears. She did not see rich or poor anymore. She did not see cruel or kind. She only saw people who had finally heard her. Her lips trembled as she whispered again, "Thank you." Though the crowd could not hear her over their cheers, somehow they understood. As she stepped through the curtain, the noise followed her, still echoing in her ears, backstage. The world was quiet again. The lights were dim, the air cool. Her body sagged, and she leaned against the wall. For the first time since she had walked onto that stage, she allowed herself to cry freely. Her tears were not of pain, but of release. The music had carried her, and now it was done behind her. The sound of applause still roared. They were calling for her, begging her to come back. But she stayed where she was. She had already given them everything, and she knew it was enough. She closed her eyes, listening to the fading sound, letting it sink deep into her heart. She would never forget it. Not as long as she lived in the days that followed. The story spread beyond the walls of the hall. Reporters wrote about her. The girl who made the audience cry. Headlines called her a genius, a miracle. A reminder that true talent does not wear silk clothes, but comes from the soul. Strangers who had once laughed at her face now wanted to know her name. People searched for her, wanting to hear her play again, wanting to understand how a little girl in worn-out shoes could change their hearts with a piano. But for the girl, it was never about fame. It was never about being called great. She did not play for applause or for headlines. She played because music was her life, her friend, her way of surviving when the world was cruel. She played because inside her lived a story that needed to be told, and that night she told it. Not with words, but with notes that spoke louder than words ever could. The grand hall remembered her. The people who had laughed remembered their shame. The judges remembered the lesson she gave them. But most of all, the girl remembered herself. She walked in thinking she was nothing, and she left knowing she was something more. She was not just a poor child in torn clothes. She was a musician who could touch hearts. She was an artist who could turn mockery into tears. And though the lights dimmed and the piano sat silent once more, the memory of her music stayed alive. It lived in the hearts of everyone who had heard it, and it would live forever for one night in one hall. A little girl showed the world that greatness can rise from the smallest places, that even a voice born from hunger and pain can make the whole world cry. And as she walked into the night, her shoes still worn, her dress still faded, she held her head high because inside her burned a light no one could ever take away.